Welcome to Military Stories. Sarah Martinez had always been different from other women her age. At 32, she carried herself with a confidence that made people take notice. Her shoulders were always straight, her walk purposeful, and her eyes held a sharpness that seemed to see everything around her. Most people assumed she was military, though she never talked about her past. On that Tuesday morning in downtown San Diego, Sarah was running errands like any other civilian. She had stopped at the local coffee shop, the same one she visited every week. The barista, Jenny, always smiled when she saw Sarah coming. There was something comforting about Sarah's presence, something that made people feel safe. "The usual?" Jenny asked, already reaching for the large black coffee. "You know me too well," Sarah replied with a small smile. She paid and took her coffee to a corner table where she could watch the street through the large windows. It was a habit she couldn't break, always positioning herself where she could see potential exits and watch for anything unusual. As she sipped her coffee and checked her phone, Sarah noticed 3 men in military uniforms enter the coffee shop. They weren't there for coffee. Their eyes scanned the room systematically until they landed on her. Sarah's body tensed automatically. Years of training kicked in, even though she tried to live a quiet life now. The man approached her table, and the tallest one, a sergeant with stern features, spoke first. "Ma'am, we need to see some identification." Sarah looked up calmly, though her heart rate had increased. "Is there a problem, officer?" "We've received reports that you've been claiming to be a Navy SEAL," the sergeant continued. "That's a serious federal offense. We need you to come with us for questioning." The coffee shop had gone quiet. Jenny behind the counter looked confused and worried. Other customers had stopped their conversations to watch the scene unfold. Sarah felt the familiar weight of unwanted attention, something she had tried so hard to avoid in her civilian life. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Sarah said quietly, reaching slowly for her wallet. She pulled out her driver's license and handed it to the sergeant. "I'm Sarah Martinez. I work at the community center downtown." The sergeant examined her ID carefully, then looked back at her. "Mrs. Martinez, we have witnesses who say you told them you were a Navy SEAL. You were at the VA hospital last week, and several people heard you talking about SEAL operations." Sarah's jaw tightened. She remembered that day clearly. She had been visiting her friend Mike, a veteran who had lost his leg in Afghanistan. Some other veterans in the waiting room had started sharing war stories, and when they asked about her service, she had been honest about her experiences. She never claimed to be something she wasn't, but she also couldn't deny what she had lived through. "I was sharing experiences with other veterans," Sarah explained. "I never impersonated anyone." "Ma'am, with all due respect, women cannot be Navy SEALs," the sergeant said firmly. "It's impossible. So either you're lying now or you were lying then. Either way, we need to sort this out at the base." Sarah felt the familiar frustration rising in her chest. This wasn't the first time her service had been questioned, and it probably wouldn't be the last. The military had changed a lot over the years, but some attitudes remained stuck in the past. "Am I under arrest?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "Not yet," the sergeant replied, "but we strongly suggest you come with us voluntarily. This can be handled quietly, or it can become a much bigger problem." Sarah looked around the coffee shop. Jenny looked like she might cry. The other customers were whispering among themselves, probably already forming opinions about what they were witnessing. Sarah had worked hard to build a peaceful life in this community, and now it felt like it was crashing down around her. She stood up slowly, her movement causing the 3 military police officers to tense slightly. Sarah noticed their reaction and made sure to keep her hands visible and her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I'll come with you, but I want to call my lawyer." "You can call your lawyer from the base. Let's go." As they walked toward the door, Jenny called out from behind the counter, "Sarah, don't worry. Everyone here knows you're a good person." Sarah turned and gave Jenny a grateful smile. "Thanks, Jen. Take care of yourself." The walk to the military police vehicle felt like the longest walk of Sarah's life. She could feel eyes on her from every direction. Neighbors who had always waved and smiled now watched with curiosity and suspicion. Children playing in the nearby park stopped their games to stare at the woman being escorted by military police. Sarah climbed into the back of the vehicle, her mind racing through possible outcomes. She knew the truth would come out eventually, but the process of getting there might destroy everything she had built in her civilian life. Her job at the community center, her friendships, her reputation in the neighborhood, all of it was now at risk. As the vehicle drove through the familiar streets of her neighborhood toward the naval base, Sarah reflected on the choices that had led her to this moment. She had always known that her past might catch up with her someday, but she had hoped for a different kind of recognition. She had hoped that when the truth came out, it would be because she chose to share it, not because she was forced to defend it. The sergeant in the front seat was making radio calls using codes and terminology that Sarah understood perfectly. She listened carefully, gathering information about what they knew and what they suspected. It seemed like someone had made an official complaint, possibly someone who had been at the VA hospital that day. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for what was coming. She knew that once they started digging into her background, everything would change. There would be no going back to her quiet life, no more anonymity, no more peace. But maybe, she thought, it was time for the truth to come out anyway. The vehicle turned through the gates of the naval base, and Sarah felt like she was returning to a world she had tried to leave behind. The familiar sights and sounds brought back memories she had worked hard to bury. Soon, those memories would be dragged into the light, and she would have to face not just the accusations against her, but the entire complicated truth of who she really was. The interrogation room at Naval Base San Diego was exactly as Sarah remembered. Sterile white walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and chairs that were designed for function rather than comfort. She had been in rooms like this before, but never on this side of the questioning. The irony wasn't lost on her. Sergeant Williams, the man who had arrested her at the coffee shop, sat across from her with a thick file folder. Next to him was Lieutenant Commander Janet Ross, a stern woman in her 40s who looked like she had seen every kind of military fraud case imaginable. They had been questioning Sarah for 2 hours, and their patience was clearly wearing thin. "Mrs. Martinez," Lieutenant Commander Ross began, her voice sharp and professional. "Let's go through this one more time. You claim you served in special operations, but we can't find any record of you in any Navy SEAL databases. Your military records show you served as a hospital corpsman, nothing more." Sarah had been expecting this. The official records never told the whole story, especially not for people who had served in the kinds of operations she had been part of. "My service was classified," she said simply. "The records you're looking at are cover stories." Sergeant Williams laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Ma'am, that's what every fake SEAL says. Oh, my records are classified. It's always the same story." "Because sometimes it's true," Sarah replied calmly. She understood their skepticism. She had probably investigated similar cases herself when she was on active duty. The difference was, she had known which claims were real and which weren't. Lieutenant Commander Ross leaned forward. "Mrs. Martinez, let me explain something to you. Impersonating a military member is a federal crime. Specifically, claiming to be a Navy SEAL can get you 5 years in federal prison and a hefty fine. This isn't a game." "I understand that," Sarah said. "I also understand that I've never impersonated anyone. I shared my experiences with fellow veterans. There's a difference." "What experiences?" Sergeant Williams demanded. "Tell us about these classified operations you supposedly participated in." Sarah looked at both officers carefully. She had been trained to read people, to assess their intentions and their capabilities. These two were good at their jobs, but they were working with incomplete information. They genuinely believed they were dealing with a fraud case, which meant someone higher up the chain of command hadn't briefed them on the full situation. "I can't discuss operational details," Sarah said, "but I can tell you that I served with distinction in multiple combat zones between 2009 and 2015. My teammates called me Doc because of my medical training, but I was qualified for and participated in direct action missions. Lieutenant Commander Ross made a note in her file. Mrs. Martinez, Navy SEALs are all male. It's a biological and physical reality. Women simply cannot meet the standards required for SEAL training. Sarah felt the familiar anger rising again, but she kept her voice level. With respect, ma'am, you're talking about the official policy, but policies and reality don't always match up, especially during wartime when you need every qualified person you can get. Are you claiming the Navy secretly allowed women to become SEALs? Sergeant Williams asked incredulously. I'm claiming that when you need someone who can shoot like a sniper, fight like a warrior, and save lives like a doctor, sometimes you make exceptions to policy, Sarah replied, especially when that person has already proven themselves in combat. The room fell silent for a moment. Sarah could see both officers processing what she had said. They were starting to realize that this case might be more complicated than they initially thought. Lieutenant Commander Ross consulted her notes again. The complaint against you came from Staff Sergeant Michael Torres. He was at the VA hospital when you allegedly made these claims. He says you told a group of veterans that you had participated in the raid that killed Abu Mansour, a high-value target in Syria. Sarah's expression didn't change, but inside she felt a chill. Abu Mansour had been a carefully planned operation, one that very few people knew the details about. If Torres knew enough to mention it specifically, he either had high-level clearance or he had heard something he shouldn't have. Staff Sergeant Torres has an interesting memory, Sarah said carefully. So you deny telling him about the Mansour operation, Sergeant Williams pressed. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. She could continue to give vague answers and hope they would eventually give up and release her, or she could start telling the truth and risk exposing information that was meant to stay buried. Neither option was appealing. I think I need to speak with someone with higher clearance, she said finally. Lieutenant Commander Ross exchanged a look with Sergeant Williams. Mrs. Martinez, this is a fraud investigation, not a national security briefing. We don't need higher clearance to determine whether you're lying about your service record. Maybe you do, Sarah said quietly. Maybe you should ask yourself why a hospital corpsman would know operational details about classified missions. Maybe you should wonder why someone with my supposedly limited training carries herself like someone who has been in combat. Maybe you should consider that there might be things about the military that you don't know. Sergeant Williams stood up abruptly. Ma'am, I've been in the Navy for 15 years. I think I know how things work. 15 years is a good start, Sarah replied. I had 12 years of active duty, plus 6 years in various contractor roles. I've seen things and done things that aren't in any manual or training program. The question is, are you willing to consider that your assumptions might be wrong? Lieutenant Commander Ross was studying Sarah more carefully now. Something in Sarah's demeanor, in the way she spoke about classified operations and combat experience, was making her reconsider her initial assessment. Mrs. Martinez, she said slowly, let's say, hypothetically, that you're telling the truth. How would we verify something that's supposedly classified beyond our clearance level? Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the room. You'd need someone with the right clearance and the right connections. Someone who was around during the time frame I mentioned. Someone who might remember a hospital corpsman who could outshoot most of the team and who saved more lives than anyone wants to count. And where would we find someone like that? Sergeant Williams asked, his skepticism still evident but tinged now with curiosity. Try Admiral Patricia Hendricks, Sarah suggested. She's retired now, but she was Deputy Director of Naval Special Warfare Operations from 2008 to 2016. If anyone would know about exceptions to policy during that time period, it would be her. Lieutenant Commander Ross wrote down the name. Mrs. Martinez, if you're making this up, if you're sending us to waste a retired admiral's time with false claims, the consequences are going to be severe. I understand, Sarah said, but I think you'll find that Admiral Hendricks remembers me. We worked together on several occasions. She might even remember the tattoo. What tattoo? Sergeant Williams asked. Sarah rolled up her left sleeve, revealing a detailed tattoo on her forearm. It showed an eagle clutching a trident and anchor with specific details that both officers recognized immediately. Below it were coordinates and a date.
"That's a SEAL team tattoo," Lieutenant Commander Ross said, her voice now uncertain. "Yes, it is," Sarah confirmed. "And if you look closely at the details, you'll see some modifications that were specific to my unit, modifications that Admiral Hendricks authorized personally." The two officers stared at the tattoo, then at each other, then back at Sarah. The confidence they had shown earlier was beginning to crack. They were starting to realize that they might be dealing with something far more complex than a simple fraud case. "We're going to need to make some phone calls," Lieutenant Commander Ross said finally.
"I'll wait," Sarah replied calmly, rolling her sleeve back down. "But I suggest you hurry. The longer this takes, the more people are going to start asking questions about why a decorated veteran is being held on false charges."
Admiral Patricia Hendricks was tending to her garden in Coronado when her secure phone rang. At 68, she had been enjoying retirement for 3 years, spending her days with her roses and her evenings reading books she never had time for during her military career. The call from Naval Base San Diego was unexpected, but the name mentioned by Lieutenant Commander Ross made her drop her gardening shears. "Sarah Martinez?" the Admiral repeated, settling into her patio chair. "I haven't heard that name in years. What's she done now?" Lieutenant Commander Ross explained the situation carefully, describing the arrest, the allegations of impersonation, and Sarah's claims about classified operations. She mentioned the tattoo and Sarah's suggestion that the Admiral would remember her.
Admiral Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, memories flooding back. Sarah Martinez had been one of the most extraordinary people she had ever worked with in the military, and also one of the most complicated cases she had ever had to handle. "Lieutenant Commander," the Admiral said finally, "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. First, you need to understand that some of what I'm going to say is still classified, even after all these years. Second, you need to treat Mrs. Martinez with the respect due to someone who served her country with exceptional distinction. And third, you need to release her immediately. Ma'am, with respect, our investigation shows no record of her serving in any special operations capacity," Lieutenant Commander Ross replied. "That's because her records were sealed at the highest levels," Admiral Hendricks explained. "What I'm about to tell you cannot be repeated outside of official channels, and only then with proper clearance. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Admiral Hendricks took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "In 2009, we faced a unique situation in Afghanistan. We had intelligence about a high-value target who was using a medical facility as cover for terrorist operations. The facility treated women and children, which meant our usual approach wouldn't work. We needed someone who could infiltrate the facility as medical personnel, gather intelligence, and, if necessary, eliminate the target." Lieutenant Commander Ross was taking notes furiously. "Ma'am, how does this relate to Mrs. Martinez?" "Hospital Corpsman Martinez had already distinguished herself in combat situations," the Admiral continued. "She had saved dozens of lives under fire, and her shooting scores were higher than most SEALs. More importantly, she had the medical credentials to operate in the environment we needed to access." The Admiral paused, remembering the debates that had raged at the highest levels of command about the operation. The Secretary of Defense personally authorized her temporary assignment to SEAL Team 6 for this specific mission. She underwent accelerated training and proved herself capable of meeting every standard we required. The mission was successful. The target was eliminated, and dozens of civilian lives were saved. "But ma'am," Lieutenant Commander Ross interjected, "women aren't allowed in SEAL teams." "Officially, no," Admiral Hendricks agreed. "But during wartime, when American lives are at stake, sometimes the brass makes exceptions. Mrs. Martinez was never officially a Navy SEAL, but she served with SEAL teams on multiple occasions over a 6-year period. She was given special clearance and operated under a classification level that most people will never even hear about. Lieutenant Commander Ross felt like her understanding of military protocol was being turned upside down. How many people knew about this arrangement? Fewer than 20 people in the entire chain of command, the Admiral replied. It was deemed necessary for operational security and for Mrs. Martinez's protection. There were people who would have tried to end her career if they had known she was operating in that capacity. What about the tattoo she mentioned? Admiral Hendricks chuckled, the first time she had smiled during the conversation. I authorized that tattoo personally. Sarah had earned it through blood, sweat, and saving more lives than I can count. The modifications she mentioned, the specific positioning of the eagle's wings and the date below the coordinates, those were my idea. I wanted there to be a way to verify her service if questions ever arose. Ma'am, this is... Lieutenant Commander Ross struggled to find words. Unprecedented? Yes, it was. But Sarah Martinez is an unprecedented person. She participated in operations that will remain classified for decades. She was wounded twice in combat and continued fighting both times. She saved the lives of team members who initially didn't want a woman on their missions. By the end of her service, those same men would have followed her into any battle.
Admiral Hendricks stood up and walked to her study, where she kept certain mementos from her military career. In a locked drawer was a photograph that few people had ever seen. Lieutenant Commander, I'm going to send you a photograph via secure transmission. It shows Mrs. Martinez with her team after a successful mission in 2013. You'll notice she's wearing the same tactical gear as everyone else, and she's holding the same weapons. That's because she was a full member of that team. Why wasn't this information available when we ran her background check? Lieutenant Commander Ross asked. Because it was designed not to be available, the Admiral explained. After Mrs. Martinez left active duty, there were concerns about her safety. She had made enemies during her service, people who would target her if they knew where to find her. The decision was made to bury her Special Operations service and allow her to disappear into civilian life. Lieutenant Commander Ross was processing this information, trying to understand the implications. So when she told those veterans at the VA hospital about her experiences, she was being honest about her service, Admiral Hendricks confirmed. The mistake was that she assumed she was among people who would understand the sensitive nature of what she was sharing. Someone obviously didn't understand that sensitivity. What should we do now, ma'am? Admiral Hendricks was quiet for a moment, considering her options. Sarah Martinez had earned the right to live in peace, but that peace had now been shattered. There would be no putting this genie back in the bottle. First, you release her immediately with a full apology, the Admiral said firmly. Second, you make sure this incident is recorded properly in her file with the appropriate security classifications. Third, you find out who made the complaint against her and make sure they understand the seriousness of what they've done. Yes, ma'am. Is there anything else? Admiral Hendricks looked at the photograph in her hands, remembering the young corpsman who had risked everything to serve her country in ways that would never be officially recognized. Yes, she said. You tell Sarah that Admiral Hendricks says it's time she stopped hiding. She's earned the right to be proud of her service, and the country has changed enough that maybe, just maybe, she can finally tell her story properly. I'll pass along that message, ma'am. And Lieutenant Commander, Admiral Hendricks added, when you see that tattoo again, remember that it represents sacrifice and service that goes far beyond what most people will ever understand. Sarah Martinez didn't just serve her country, she helped redefine what service means. After ending the call, Admiral Hendricks sat in her study for a long time, holding the photograph and remembering one of the finest warriors she had ever had the privilege to command. She wondered if Sarah was ready for her story to finally come to light, or if the quiet life she had built would be enough to sustain her through what was coming next. Outside, the sun was setting over Coronado, casting long shadows across the garden she had been tending when the call came. Tomorrow, she thought she might need to make some calls of her own. There were people who needed to know that Sarah Martinez's story was about to become public, and preparations would need to be made.
Lieutenant Commander Ross returned to the interrogation room with a completely different demeanor than when she had left. Her stern expression had been replaced by something that looked almost like embarrassment. Sergeant Williams noticed the change immediately and straightened in his chair. Sarah looked up as they entered, reading their body language with the skill of someone trained to assess situations quickly. She could see that something fundamental had changed during their absence. "Mrs. Martinez," Lieutenant Commander Ross began, then stopped and cleared her throat. Petty Officer Martinez, I owe you an apology." Sarah raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best response was to let other people fill the silence. "We spoke with Admiral Hendricks," Lieutenant Commander Ross continued. "She explained the situation, your situation. I had no idea that someone with your background was operating in our area of responsibility." Sergeant Williams looked confused, glancing between his superior officer and Sarah. "Ma'am, what exactly did the Admiral tell you?" Lieutenant Commander Ross hesitated, clearly struggling with how much she could reveal. "Sergeant, what I can tell you is that Mrs. Martinez's service record is classified at levels we don't have access to. She served with distinction in special operations from 2009 to 2015, and her claims about her experience are legitimate." "But women can't be SEALs," Sergeant Williams protested. "Officially, that's correct," Lieutenant Commander Ross agreed. "But during wartime, exceptions are sometimes made for extraordinary circumstances and extraordinary people." Sarah finally spoke. "Sergeant Williams, I understand your confusion. I lived in that confusion for 6 years. Every day I had to prove myself to people who didn't think I belonged. Every mission I had to earn the right to be there. It wasn't easy and it wasn't always fair, but it was necessary." Sergeant Williams stared at her, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with everything he thought he knew about military structure and protocol. "The tattoo," Lieutenant Commander Ross said. "Admiral Hendricks explained the modifications. She said you earned every line of that design." Sarah rolled up her sleeve again, looking at the tattoo she had carried for nearly a decade. "The eagle's wings are positioned at a specific angle that represents the missions I participated in. The coordinates mark the location where I pulled 3 team members out of an ambush in Afghanistan. The date is when I was officially cleared for direct action operations." She pointed to small details that neither officer had noticed during their first examination. "These symbols here represent the different specializations I qualified for: medical, communications, demolitions, and marksmanship. Admiral Hendricks said if anyone ever questioned my service, these details would prove my legitimacy to anyone with the right knowledge." Lieutenant Commander Ross was taking notes again, but this time her purpose was different. Instead of building a case against Sarah, she was documenting the resolution of a mistaken investigation. "Mrs. Martinez, I need to ask you about the complaint that brought you here. Staff Sergeant Torres claimed you were boasting about classified operations. How do you want us to handle that?" Sarah's expression hardened slightly. "Torres was at the VA hospital when I was visiting a friend. A group of veterans were sharing war stories, and when they asked about my service, I shared some experiences. I was careful not to reveal operational details, but I did mention that I had been involved in certain missions. Torres seemed to know specific details about the Abu Mansour operation," Sergeant Williams noted. "That's interesting," Sarah said, "because that operation was classified at such a high level that very few people knew the details. If Torres knows about it, either he has clearance I wasn't aware of, or he heard something he shouldn't have." Lieutenant Commander Ross made another note. "We'll need to investigate how Torres came by that information." "There's something else you should know," Sarah continued. "When I left active duty in 2015, there were complications. Some people weren't happy about the exceptions that had been made for me. There were threats made, both official and unofficial. That's why my records were sealed and why I was encouraged to maintain a low profile in civilian life." "What kind of threats?" Lieutenant Commander Ross asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, remembering the final months of her military career. There were people who felt that allowing a woman to serve in special operations was a dangerous precedent. They worried that it would lead to changes in policy that they weren't ready for. Some of them made it clear that they would prefer if my service record disappeared entirely. "Are you saying someone orchestrated this complaint to expose you?" Sergeant Williams asked. "I'm saying that Torres knowing details about classified operations is suspicious," Sarah replied. "Either he has legitimate access to that information, which raises questions about why he's using it to file complaints against me, or he has illegitimate access, which is a much bigger problem." Lieutenant Commander Ross was beginning to understand the complexity of the situation they had stumbled into. What had started as a simple fraud investigation was revealing layers of classification, political tension, and potentially compromised security. "Mrs. Martinez, Admiral Hendricks asked me to pass along a message," she said. "She said, it's time you stopped hiding. She thinks you've earned the right to be proud of your service and that maybe the country is ready to hear your story properly." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. The Admiral always was an optimist. She believed that people would eventually accept change, that merit would ultimately matter more than tradition. I'm not sure I share her confidence. "Things have changed since 2015, Lieutenant Commander Ross pointed out. Women are now allowed in combat roles that were previously closed to them. The military is evolving." "Policy changes and cultural changes are different things," Sarah replied. "The policy might allow women in special operations now, but that doesn't mean the culture has accepted it. I'm living proof of that. Here I am, 8 years after leaving active duty, still having to defend my service record." Sergeant Williams had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what was it like being the only woman in those situations?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Lonely sometimes, difficult often, but also incredibly rewarding. I saved lives, I completed missions that helped keep America safe, and I proved that capability matters more than gender. The men I served with eventually accepted me based on my performance, not my gender. That acceptance meant everything." "And now?" Lieutenant Commander Ross asked. "What happens now that this has come to light?" Sarah stood up and walked to the small window in the interrogation room. Outside, she could see the familiar sights of the naval base where she had once trained and prepared for missions that would take her around the world. "Now I have to decide whether I want to keep hiding or whether I'm ready to deal with the consequences of being public. Either way, my quiet life is over. Too many people know now, and word will spread." She turned back to face the two officers. "The question is, what are you going to do with this information? Are you going to quietly close this case and let me disappear again? Or are you going to make sure the record reflects the truth about my service?" Lieutenant Commander Ross and Sergeant Williams exchanged glances. They both understood that their decision would have implications far beyond this single case. They were dealing with a piece of military history that had been hidden for nearly a decade, and their choice would determine whether that history remained buried or finally came to light. "Mrs. Martinez, Admiral Hendricks asked me to pass along a message," she said. "She said, it's time you stopped hiding. She thinks you've earned the right to be proud of your service and that maybe the country is ready to hear your story properly." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. The Admiral always was an optimist. She believed that people would eventually accept change, that merit would ultimately matter more than tradition. I'm not sure I share her confidence. "Things have changed since 2015, Lieutenant Commander Ross pointed out. Women are now allowed in combat roles that were previously closed to them. The military is evolving." "Policy changes and cultural changes are different things," Sarah replied. "The policy might allow women in special operations now, but that doesn't mean the culture has accepted it. I'm living proof of that. Here I am, 8 years after leaving active duty, still having to defend my service record." Sergeant Williams had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what was it like being the only woman in those situations?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Lonely sometimes, difficult often,
but also incredibly rewarding. I saved lives, I completed missions that helped keep America safe, and I proved that capability matters more than gender. The men I served with eventually accepted me based on my performance, not my gender. That acceptance meant everything. And now? Lieutenant Commander Ross asked. What happens now that this has come to light? Sarah stood up and walked to the small window in the interrogation room. Outside, she could see the familiar sights of the naval base where she had once trained and prepared for missions that would take her around the world. Now I have to decide whether I want to keep hiding or whether I'm ready to deal with the consequences of being public. Either way, my quiet life is over. Too many people know now, and word will spread. She turned back to face the two officers. The question is, what are you going to do with this information? Are you going to quietly close this case and let me disappear again? Or are you going to make sure the record reflects the truth about my service? Lieutenant Commander Ross and Sergeant Williams exchanged glances. They both understood that their decision would have implications far beyond this single case. They were dealing with a piece of military history that had been hidden for nearly a decade, and their choice would determine whether that history remained buried or finally came to light.
3 days after Sarah's release from custody, the investigation took an unexpected turn. Lieutenant Commander Ross had spent those days digging deeper into Staff Sergeant Torres's background, and what she found troubled her deeply. Torres had been asking questions about classified operations for months, reaching out to veterans through social media and veteran support groups. Sarah sat in a secure conference room at Naval Base San Diego, this time as a consultant rather than a suspect. Across from her sat Lieutenant Commander Ross, Sergeant Williams, and a new face, Commander David Chen from Naval Criminal Investigative Service. The atmosphere was tense, but collaborative. "Mrs. Martinez," Commander Chen began, "we need your help understanding something. Staff Sergeant Torres has been systematically contacting veterans from Special Operations units, asking specific questions about missions that should be classified. Your case wasn't isolated." Sarah leaned forward, her instincts sharpening. "How many other veterans has he contacted?" "At least 17 that we've identified so far," Lieutenant Commander Ross replied. "All from units that conducted classified operations between 2008 and 2016. All asked about specific missions using details that should not be publicly available." "What kind of details?" Sarah asked. Commander Chen consulted his notes. "Target names, locations, dates, tactical approaches, information that could only come from mission briefings or after-action reports. The level of detail suggests access to classified documents." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "You think Torres is gathering intelligence?" "We think Torres is working for someone who is gathering intelligence," Commander Chen clarified. "His financial records show payments from a consulting company that traces back to a defense contractor with questionable international connections." Sergeant Williams looked confused. "But Torres is still active duty. Why would he risk his career for money?" "Money might not be the primary motivation," Sarah said quietly. "If someone wanted to expose the classified programs I was part of, targeting veterans who might be willing to talk would be an efficient approach. Most of us aren't supposed to talk about our service, so we're isolated from each other. Someone fishing for information might catch more than they expect." Commander Chen nodded. "That matches our assessment. Torres may have been tasked with identifying veterans from classified programs and then provoking them into revealing operational details by filing false accusations that would force investigations." Lieutenant Commander Ross added, "which would potentially bring classified information into official records." Sarah sat back in her chair, processing the implications. So Torres knew exactly who I was when he filed that complaint. This wasn't about him being offended by a woman claiming to be a SEAL. This was about forcing me to prove my credentials, which would require declassifying information about programs that are still sensitive. Commander Chen confirmed, "If we had proceeded with a formal investigation without Admiral Hendricks' intervention, details about your service would have become part of the official record. And once it's in the official record, it's much easier for foreign intelligence services to access." Sarah realized,
Even with classification levels, there are always ways to piece together information from official sources. Lieutenant Commander Ross was taking notes furiously. Mrs. Martinez, during your conversation with the veterans at the VA hospital, did Torres ask any specific questions? Sarah closed her eyes, remembering that day. He didn't participate much in the general conversation, but when I mentioned that I had served in a medical capacity in combat zones, he asked very specific questions about which zones and which time periods. At the time, I thought he was just curious, but looking back, his questions were very targeted. "What did you tell him?" Commander Chen asked. I was vague about locations, but I did mention time frames. I said that I had been deployed between 2009 and 2015, primarily in Afghanistan and Syria. I mentioned that I had been cross-trained for special operations support. That seemed to trigger more questions from him. "What kind of questions?" Sergeant Williams asked. Sarah thought carefully. He asked about specific operations, mentioned names of targets that hadn't been in the news. At the time, I assumed he had served in similar capacities and was testing whether I was legitimate. Now I realize he was probably testing how much I knew and how much I might be willing to reveal. Commander Chen made more notes. "Mrs. Martinez, we believe Torres has been building profiles of veterans from classified programs. Your case suggests he's been successful in identifying people who served in capacities that don't match their official records."
"Which means there are others like me," Sarah said quietly. "Other people who served in ways that were never officially acknowledged." "That's our concern," Lieutenant Commander Ross agreed. "If Torres has identified a network of veterans from classified programs, and if he's working for someone who wants to expose those programs, we could be looking at a significant security breach." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base where she had once prepared for missions she could never talk about. "Commander Chen, how long has Torres been doing this?" "We've traced suspicious activity back at least 18 months, Commander Chen replied, "but it could have been going on longer. He's been careful, spacing out his contacts using different approaches." 18 months, Sarah repeated. "That's right around the time the military started officially opening combat roles to women. Someone might have wanted to get ahead of any revelations about women who had already been serving in those roles unofficially." Lieutenant Commander Ross looked up from her notes. "You think this is politically motivated?" "I think someone realized that as policies changed, stories like mine might come to light naturally," Sarah explained. "Better to control the narrative by gathering information in advance. If you know which veterans served in classified capacities, you can either discredit them or use their stories for your own purposes." Commander Chen leaned forward. "Mrs. Martinez, we need your help with something. We want to set up a controlled operation to catch Torres in the act. Are you willing to make contact with him again?" Sarah turned back to face the group. "What did you have in mind?" "Torres doesn't know that his complaint against you backfired," Lieutenant Commander Ross explained. "As far as he knows, you were arrested for impersonation and possibly prosecuted. We could have you reach out to him, maybe claiming you want to thank him for exposing fraudulent claims that were hurting real veterans." "And then?" Sarah asked. "Then we see if he tries to recruit you to help identify other fraudulent veterans," Commander Chen said. "If he's working for someone who wants to map out classified programs, he might try to use you as an asset." Sarah considered the proposal. It would mean stepping back into the world of deception and manipulation she had tried to leave behind, but it would also mean protecting other veterans who might be targeted. "There's a risk," she said finally. "If Torres is as sophisticated as you think, he might realize it's a trap. And if his employers discover I'm working with you, they might accelerate whatever timeline they're operating on." "We understand the risks," Commander Chen assured her, "but right now you're our best lead into understanding the scope of this operation." Sarah walked back to the table and sat down. "Before I agree to anything, I need to know something. What happens to the other veterans Torres has already contacted? Are they at risk?" "We're working on identifying and contacting them," Lieutenant Commander Ross said, "but it's complicated. Most of them served in programs that are still classified. We can't just call them up and ask about their secret missions." "No, but I might be able to," Sarah said thoughtfully. If Torres has been targeting people like me, people who served in unofficial capacities, then we probably have things in common. Similar backgrounds, similar experiences, similar frustrations with not being able to talk about our service. Commander Chen was interested. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that instead of just using me to catch Torres, you use me to reach out to the other veterans he's contacted. People like us tend to recognize each other. We have ways of communicating that confirm our backgrounds without revealing classified information. Sergeant Williams looked skeptical. That sounds risky. If these veterans are being targeted, making contact with them might put them in more danger. Or it might protect them, Sarah countered. Right now, they're isolated, probably confused about why someone is asking them questions about things they're not supposed to talk about. If I can make contact and explain what's happening, they can make informed decisions about how to protect themselves. Lieutenant Commander Ross was nodding slowly. It's not a bad idea. Mrs. Martinez has credibility with this population that we don't have. She speaks their language, understands their situation. But it expands the operation significantly, Commander Chen pointed out. Instead of a simple sting operation targeting Torres, we're talking about a complex investigation involving multiple veterans across different states. Sarah looked at each of the officers in turn. Gentlemen, 18 months ago, I was living a quiet life, working at a community center, trying to forget about classified missions and secret wars. 3 days ago, I was arrested for impersonating a SEAL. Now you're telling me that my story is part of a larger pattern, that other veterans like me are being targeted, and that sensitive national security information might be compromised. She paused, letting that sink in. I didn't ask for any of this, but now that I'm involved, I'm not going to do things halfway. If Torres and his employers want to expose classified programs, they're going to have to go through me first. And I promise you, that's not going to be easy. Commander Chen smiled for the first time since entering the room. Mrs. Martinez, I think we're going to work very well together. 6 weeks later, Sarah stood in the same conference room where her new mission had begun, but the atmosphere was completely different. The table was covered with files, photographs, and evidence that represented the successful conclusion of one of the most complex counterintelligence operations Naval Criminal Investigative Service had conducted in years. Commander Chen looked tired but satisfied as he addressed the assembled group, which now included Admiral Hendricks, who had come out of retirement to oversee the final phases of the operation. Ladies and gentlemen, Commander Chen began, Operation Silent Service has been a complete success. We've identified and neutralized a foreign intelligence operation that was targeting veterans of classified special operations programs. Sarah listened as he outlined the results. Torres had indeed been working for a defense contractor with ties to foreign intelligence services. The operation had been designed to map out classified U.S. special operations capabilities by identifying and compromising veterans who had served in unofficial capacities. Mrs. Martinez's work was instrumental in breaking this case, Commander Chen continued. She successfully made contact with 14 of the 17 veterans Torres had targeted, warned them about the operation, and helped us gather evidence of the intelligence-gathering effort. Admiral Hendricks spoke up from her position at the head of the table. What's the status on the veterans who were targeted? All have been contacted and briefed, Lieutenant Commander Ross reported. Most are relieved to finally understand what was happening to them. Several have expressed interest in having their service records properly documented with appropriate security classifications. Sarah smiled at that news. One of the most rewarding aspects of the operation had been connecting with other veterans who had served in similar circumstances. Like her, many of them had been struggling with the isolation of not being able to talk about their service. "What about Torres?" Sergeant Williams asked. "Staff Sergeant Torres is cooperating fully with the investigation," Commander Chen replied.
He was recruited by the defense contractor through financial pressure, gambling debts that he couldn't pay. He didn't fully understand what he was participating in until we showed him the evidence. "And the contractor?" Admiral Hendricks inquired. "3 arrests so far, including the primary handler," Commander Chen said. "We're working with other agencies to determine the full scope of their intelligence-gathering operations."
Sarah had played a crucial role in exposing the contractor's methods. By pretending to be willing to help Torres identify other fraudulent veterans, she had been able to record conversations that revealed the true purpose of his inquiries. The evidence she gathered had been sufficient to obtain warrants for the offices and communications. Admiral Hendricks turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Martinez, I believe this experience has given you some perspective on your situation. What are your plans moving forward?" Sarah had been thinking about that question for weeks. The operation had forced her to confront her past and consider her future in ways she hadn't expected. "Admiral, for 8 years I've been trying to hide from my service record," she said. "I thought the best way to honor what I'd done was to disappear quietly and never talk about it. This experience has shown me that hiding doesn't protect anyone, not me, not other veterans, and not national security." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I've decided to work with the military to properly document the programs I was part of with appropriate classifications and security measures. Other veterans deserve to have their service recognized, even if that recognition is limited to official channels." Lieutenant Commander Ross nodded approvingly. "We've been working on a framework for that, a way to acknowledge service in classified programs without compromising ongoing operations or security." "What about your civilian life?" Admiral Hendricks asked. "You've built something meaningful at the community center." Sarah smiled. "Actually, this experience has shown me how much I missed working on complex problems with talented people. Commander Chen has asked if I'd be interested in consulting work with NCIS, helping them understand how to investigate cases involving veterans of classified programs." Commander Chen confirmed this. "Mrs. Martinez has unique insights into this population. She understands both the operational and psychological aspects of serving in unofficial capacities. We could use her expertise." "And the community center?" Sergeant Williams asked. "I'll continue working there part-time," Sarah replied. "The veterans I serve there need someone who understands their experiences. Now I can be more helpful to them, knowing that I don't have to hide my own background." Admiral Hendricks looked pleased. "Mrs. Martinez, 8 years ago, when I authorized your service with Special Operations Units, I knew we were setting a precedent. I hoped that someday your service would be recognized properly. I'm glad that day has finally come." She stood up and walked around the table to where Sarah was sitting. "There's something else," the Admiral said, pulling a small box from a briefcase. "This is long overdue." Inside the box was a Bronze Star medal, along with official documentation of Sarah's service record, properly classified but officially recognized for exceptional service in combat operations. Admiral Hendricks read from the citation. "Hospital Corpsman First Class Sarah Martinez distinguished herself through extraordinary heroism and professional skill during multiple special operations missions. Her actions directly contributed to mission success and saved the lives of numerous teammates and civilians." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she accepted the medal. For 8 years, she had carried the weight of unrecognized service, wondering if what she had done mattered to anyone besides herself and the people she had served with. "Thank you, Admiral," she said quietly. "This means more than you know." Commander Chen stood up. "Mrs. Martinez, there's one more thing. The investigation revealed that several other women served in similar capacities during the same time period. They've been dealing with the same isolation and uncertainty you experienced. Would you be interested in helping us reach out to them?" Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who had become colleagues and friends over the past 6 weeks. For the first time since leaving active duty, she felt like she was part of a team again. "Commander, I thought you'd never ask." 3 months later, Sarah stood in front of a small group of women veterans at a secure facility in Virginia. Each of them had served in special operations capacities that had never been officially acknowledged. Each had been struggling with the isolation of not being able to talk about their service. "Ladies," Sarah began, "for years, each of us thought we were alone. We thought our stories were too sensitive to share, too complicated to explain, too unusual for anyone to understand. Today, we start changing that." She looked at each woman in turn, seeing her own experiences reflected in their faces. "We served our country with distinction in roles that weren't supposed to exist. We proved that capability matters more than gender, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important service happens in the shadows. Now it's time to step into the light." The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the women spoke up. "What happens now?" Sarah smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought her from a coffee shop arrest to this moment of recognition and purpose. "Now we make sure that the women who come after us don't have to hide their service. We make sure that their stories are told properly, with honor and recognition, and we make sure that no one can ever again question whether we belonged where we served." She paused, feeling the weight of the bronze star in her pocket and the responsibility it represented. "Now we make sure that our service matters, not just to us, but to history." Outside the secure facility, American flags flew in the Virginia breeze, symbols of the country these women had served in ways that few would ever fully understand. Their stories would remain classified for years to come, but they would no longer be forgotten. They would no longer be alone, and they would no longer have to hide who they were and what they had accomplished. Sarah Martinez had learned that sometimes the greatest act of service is simply refusing to disappear.